There were 3 different times in my life that I've done that. Mm-hmm. The first was my mom died 2 days before my 12th birthday, and that was a lot to deal with because I was the only child left in the home out of 4 siblings, and it was just me and my dad, and my dad was really upset, of course, because they've been married for 20 years, and I felt like I had to maintain and be strong around him, because anytime I would start crying, he would start crying. So that was the first time in my life that I started cutting. And it occurred to me one day out of the blue in art class in school, and I think I was in 7th or 8th grade, and I was cutting out something with an X-Acto knife. And I just thought, I wonder what would happen if, and I stuck the X-Acto knife in my backpack, and I went home from school and started cutting on my arm. And I didn't really feel anything. It didn't really do anything for me. But I did it the next day, and I did it the next day, and it was luckily cold, so I could wear the long sleeves and cover it up, and at that time I just kind of lost interest because it just wasn't having any effect on me. Mm-hmm. That was the first time. The second time was about 3 years later when I was 15. It was still just me and my dad, and I was having a lot of the teenage rebellion issues, and I was hanging around with people that weren't very good for me. They were the typical bad seeds, and we were drinking a lot and doing drugs, and I was dealing with a lot of stuff at that time because my dad just didn't know how to deal with me. He was dating. He had gotten pretty steady with this one lady and had asked her to marry him, and she had told him that she was not going to marry him until I was out of the house, meaning that she didn't want to marry him until I was 18, and he took that as a sign that he needed to move me out. So I went to one of my friend's house for the weekend, and I came home, and he had moved me into my sister's house. So that hurt a lot, and that was the second time I started cutting. And it was pretty much the same. It wasn't something I planned to do. Mm-hmm. The opportunity was there, the means were there. I believe that time I used a razor. And that time I was a little bit smarter about it because it wasn't winter. That time I was cutting on my upper legs. And that time it did do something for me. It was more of the rush factor than anything. It was the endorphins that you get after you do that, and the pain, and it was very real, and it was at a time that I was very numb to a lot of things, and that kind of helped me center myself and focus on something other than how horrible my life was, and my dad didn't want me, and my friends were horrible. And that time I probably continued for about 3 to 6 months, somewhere in there. It wasn't every day. It was usually after I had to deal with my dad at some point. And it's not that my dad didn't care, it was just he was horribly misguided in his attempts. And, you know, when you're 15, you don't think straight anyway. And so that it was usually after I had to deal with him, or, you know, one of my friends had done something mean, which they did a lot. And it was my way of centering myself and bringing me back to something else to focus on other than how bad things were. Mm-hmm. Then the third time, embarrassing to say, was about 3 years ago. And I was involved with a man who was very unhealthy for me. It was a very unhealthy relationship, and he had put me basically in a competition with another woman, and let me know about it. He was he put the competition on himself. He would let me know that he was going to see her that night, or he was going out with her that night. And at the time, I said, well, I love him enough, I'm just going to deal with it. But what I didn't realize was that my esteem was on the floor, and I didn't think enough of myself to think that I deserved anything better. So my way of dealing with that was, because I tried to be the strong person around him and pretend that didn't bother me, so my way of dealing with that was to cut again. And again, it wasn't something I planned. It was just one day I was in the kitchen and I was doing dishes and washing a steak knife and slipped and I cut my hand. And it was like, huh. And so grabbed my sharpest paring knife and I went into the bathroom, and again, I was smart enough to do it this time up on my thighs and hips to where people couldn't see. And that time, the motivation behind it was a pain release. It was like the only way that I could cry at that point. So that time I stopped finally because I got rid of him. And once he was out of my life and that competition was gone and I was allowed to have the feelings that I was feeling, then I could stop. And I didn't have to do that anymore. Well, looking back, it's hard because I can almost forgive myself for doing it as a 12-year-old, and I can forgive myself for doing it as a 15-year-old. But as a 30-year-old woman, it's really hard to think that that's just 3 years ago, and I was doing that. And it's made me a lot more sensitive to what people are feeling and not voicing, to what's going on inside their heads and what's going on inside their hearts. And it's really made me want to reach out to people that I see doing that or that I think are in that frame of mind, and to let them know that, you know, they don't have to do that, that they can talk. And you don't have to be in that state of mind. You don't have to be in that place where you feel that that's your only release. I think that if you've never done it and you don't know the reasons behind it, I think it's very easy to dismiss it as an attention-seeking gadget. I think that if you can't understand it, it's easy to look at a person who does that and go, oh, they just want attention. Or the opposite end of the scale, they're trying to kill themselves. And neither one of those were ever the case with me. Most of the time, the 2 times that I had done it, I did it in places that people couldn't even see. So clearly it wasn't for attention. And I never had any intentions of killing myself by doing that. I never wanted to injure myself to the point that somebody was going to find me dead on a floor. It was just a means of getting out emotion for me. But I think it's very easy to look at it on the surface and see somebody who has things carved into their arm or scars here and there and think, oh, that person's just wanting attention. They just want people to ask, why are you doing that to yourself? Or somebody to pay attention to them and say, oh, you got to stop doing that. And that's not the case. I think those ages are very difficult times. It's when you're starting to face a lot of when you're 17, you're starting to become an adult, but you're not an adult yet. You still want to do teenager things, but you're being forced to make decisions about what are you going to do after you get out of high school? What are you going to do for a career? And those are lifelong decisions that you're supposed to be making. And then once you get out of high school and say you do go to college, then you're in this whole new environment with all these new people and all these new pressures. And you may have been the most popular girl in high school, and you get to college and you're nothing special. You're just another face in the crowd. And I think if you never learned a good way to deal with pressure or a way to deal with emotions, or say in the case you go to college, you lose your best friends because they've gone somewhere else and you don't have that person to talk to, I think it's an easy resort to go to start cutting on yourself and ignore everything else that's going on. Well, addictions are really hard to deal with. The first piece of advice I would give them is that they've got to find somebody to talk to about it. And they've got to find somebody that's not going to mock them or think they're looking for attention. The best piece of advice I could say is to find somebody who's done it themselves and understands and has stopped, and have them help that person get through it. But another thing is you need to find a different release, some other way to deal with whatever it is that you're dealing with.